lot of people who didn't. Now, me personally, I don't know anyone.
Was there a serious challenger in the election? A serious opponent?
Is there a need for a serious opponent? Why?
Why is there no need for a serious opponent?
Why do you always think that the way you live is better than the way we're living? You know better.
Not at all.
Yes, you do.
Why do you think there's...
Even the way you ask questions, you do. Why don't you guys do the way we do it? Because we're not you, and we don't like you much, really.
Was I offended? No. Surprised? No. Was I persuaded that Russia's election had indeed been a level playing field and a victory for democracy? Once again, no. But the Kremlin will pay no attention to Western criticism. It will portray Vladimir Putin as a leader loved and trusted by his people. And Mr. Putin will use his 87% landslide as a mandate for whatever action he decides to take next.
Well, we like Steve Rosenberg very, very much. The time is 4 minutes.
Thanks very much, Jamal. Who is the Black Boy? He stares out from an almost 200-year-old portrait in the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. Barefoot, in torn, loose clothing, relaxed but somehow intense, an individual without a name or a history. Now the Slavery Museum is trying to work out just who this boy is. Kate Haselden is Research Fellow for the Understanding British Portraits Network. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a rare portrait, isn't it, in that it is an individual. He is not an enslaved person, he is not a servant, he is a person.
Absolutely. It's very rare to have a finished oil painting of a young black child from this period, and let alone one that is well executed and quite sensitive as well.
Given its rarity, is it surprising that we don't know the boy's identity?
Unfortunately not. When we're talking about the black presence in British portraiture from the 19th century and beforehand, and often afterwards as well, there is a lot of anonymity, and there are many unnamed subjects there. Often the subject is identified solely by their heritage, very similar to the title The Black Boy that we have with our portrait. So unfortunately, being an anonymous subject is not unusual, but what is unusual is the skill and the depth of this portrait.
It's beautiful, no doubt about that. I suppose the question is how you are now going to try and give this boy an identity.
Absolutely. Well, it's a good question, and information could be anywhere. So during this project, I've managed to find out more about the artist's history himself. So the story goes that he met the boy on the steps of a place called the Monument Hotel in Liverpool. And myself and a colleague at the International Slavery Museum did some digging and managed to find out that the artist's mother, a woman called Agnes, ran the Monument Hotel in Liverpool, and Windus, the artist, was listed as living there between 1841 and 1851, which is when the portrait would have been created. So it's quite an amazing discovery because it shows that he was living in the place that he would have found this child, as the story goes. So information could be anywhere. So it could be that this child in the portrait went on to have descendants and they could have material buried somewhere. Windus was quite an important member of the Liverpool Academy of Arts, and it could be that people have letters, documents from the academy hidden somewhere, and also descendants of Windus himself. So I've managed to speak to a few descendants during this project, and sadly no family documents have come to light yet, but family trees stretch for miles, so it could be that information could be anywhere.
Well, promise us one thing, Kate, you will come and tell us when you find out. Kate Haselden, thank you very much.
Johnny, thank you for looking after me. That is it from us. Our editors today were Hannah Wilkinson and Jack Evans. The studio director was Shona O'Donoghue. After the news, Melvin Bragg and his guests will be discussing the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate. Have a lovely Thursday.
BBC News at 9 o'clock. Pension campaigners are hoping a report out this morning will lead to significant compensation payments. The group, Women Against State Pension Inequality, says many women born in the 1950s were pushed into poverty after their state pension age was raised in line with men's. A 5-year inquiry has already found the government was slow in telling women about the change. Karen Woodward from Dorset says she was 58 and struggling with arthritis, and she found out she was one of those affected.
A huge shock, partly because being self-employed, I didn't start a pension plan because I didn't think or ever put any money by it because I didn't think there was any need to, because as soon as I turned 60 I would be getting the state pension that I'd grown up believing that I would get at 60, that I'd been paying into.
A leading child protection expert has said tens of thousands of young people are at risk of being groomed and coerced into organised crime. Professor Alexis Jay, who helped to reveal the extent of child sexual exploitation in Rotherham, is calling for a national plan and new legislation to tackle the issue. Rishi Sunak's flagship policy on migration, the Rwanda Bill, won't now return to the Commons before Easter, after the Lords inflicted another series of defeats on the government's draft law. The legislation is intended to stop court challenges to efforts to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda by declaring the East African country to be safe. An AI tool tested by the NHS Grampian Hospital Trust has boosted the diagnosis rate for early-stage breast cancer by 12%. It was able to detect signs of cancer in 11 women that were missed by doctors. Researchers say more trials are needed. The largest gold nugget ever found in England, weighing 65 grams, has been put up for auction online. It was found by a metal detectorist on a dig in the Shropshire Hills last May. It's expected to fetch £30,000 to £40,000. BBC News.
This is BBC Radio 4. It's the first day of spring and we'll be celebrating some brighter weather on the wireless this afternoon when we're off on a stroll around the Dyfi Valley alongside a donkey called Chico. Claire Boulding will take the reins in Ramblings at 3 o'clock. But first, here's Melvyn Bragg with In Our Time.
Hello. Considering he ruled as Roman Emperor for less than 2 years, 361 to 363 AD, Julian the Apostate made an extraordinary impression on history. Christians saw him as a villain who returned the empire to paganism after Constantine the Great's conversion early that century, while Gibbon was to see that return as a heroic attempt to halt the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And he was a philosopher emperor, inspired by Marcus Aurelius, writing satires, being written about in turn, leaving a remarkable record. With me to discuss Julian the Apostate are James Cork Webster, reader in classics, history and liberal arts at King's College London, Leah Nicolai, Assistant Professor in Classics at the University of Cambridge and Fellow and Director of Studies in Classics, Trinity College, and Sean Tucker, Professor at Mayfair and the Byzantine Institute.
Prior to Constantine, there was a power-sharing system with multiple emperors, but Constantine re-established the dynastic principle and ruled with members of his family, but he was the only Augustus. So by the time Julian is born in 331 or 332, Constantine has established himself in power. He has been promoting and supporting Christianity, and also dramatically he has refounded the ancient Greek city of Byzantium as Constantinople. That was dedicated in 330, and that's modern-day Istanbul. And actually Julian was to be the first emperor to be born in Constantinople.
Sean, so we've heard about stability, but then some of Julian's own family was slaughtered. What's going on there?
Yes. I mean, this happens after the death of Constantine the Great, so he died in 337. And the dynastic situation is quite complicated. When Constantine dies, he has 3 surviving sons. but he also has relatives through the other branch of the family. His father had married twice and had children by 2 different women, so there are actually a lot of half-siblings and their descendants on the scene as well. So Constantine's half-brothers and their sons are being brought into the imperial system at the time of Constantine's death. So we have the so-called Summer of Blood in 337 after the death of Constantine, and this is when the sons of Constantine eliminate a lot of these other members of the family. They want to secure power for themselves. His sons are actually quite young, they're sort of in their early 20s, if that, at this stage. So they might have felt threatened by this other branch of the family, and they're quite ruthless in eliminating them, and in particular it's his son, Constantine's son, Constantius II, who's particularly attributed with overseeing these killings.
Thank you very much. Leah Nikolai. Let's switch to Julian's education. It really matters in this story. It's key to him in a way. So how was he educated?
Julian's education is quite of an impressive journey, and I mean it both in cultural and even in geographical terms, because Julian travels across his youth, and his education begins when he's just a little child, after this family purge that had exterminated, among others, also his father and the eldest of his brothers. Julian is taken to Nicomedia, the city of Nicomedia in Asia Minor, and there, ironically, his first teacher is a bishop, Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, who later on would become the Bishop of Constantinople. Now, I said ironically because we all know that Julian afterwards, his fame is due to the fact that he tried to restore the traditional Greco-Roman religion, but actually knowing that he was raised as a Christian as a child helps us understand what kind of grasp he had of the religion that at some point he was trying to oppose. Then afterwards he kept traveling, he kept being moved around, we should say, because his cousin Constantius II was sending him to other cities. For instance, he sent him to Cappadocia, which was a remote region, probably because he didn't want Julian to get in contact with his other brother, Constans, who was becoming more powerful in the West. And at the very beginning of his training, Julian goes through the traditional educational path of the Roman elites. So essentially he studies Plato, first Homer of course, Plato, but especially rhetoric. So he's taught by Ecebolius, a famous rhetorician of the time, indirectly also by the even more famous rhetorician Libanius, who was a rival with Ecebolius. So Julian was not allowed to take his classes, but he was so passionate about the teaching of Libanius that allegedly he would have sent his servants to gather, to fetch the notes for him so that he could learn from this master. And then the real turning point happens around Julian's 20th year of age, or so he says in his letters, the moment in which he leaves the study of rhetoric, following his discovery of philosophy, more specifically Neoplatonic philosophy, which becomes his love, his passion for the rest of his life. So he begins to travel across Greece and Asia Minor to search for the perfect master, we could say. And eventually he finds this figure in Maximus of Tyre, who was a philosopher, but at the same time he performed what now we call theurgy. There was a sort of set of mystical rites meant to put the philosophers in communication with the gods. And by this time Julian has already joined the traditional religion, so he's no more a member of the church as he was as a child.
Thank you very much, James Cockworster. He declares himself to be an alien to Christianity. Why was he turning away from this religion?
The simplest answer to that question, and the sort of reasoning that he himself gives, is that when he comes under the influence of Maximus, who Leah mentioned before, the Neoplatonist, he sort of has an intellectual awakening and realizes that this is a superior intellectual offering, which is a better explanation than the Christianity that he was raised with has
explanation of what?
Explanation of the nature of reality, the nature of the gods, the reasons we're all here.
Is this the idea of the one, and then it's extrapolated from the one?
Very good. Yeah, that's a good kind of opening gambit for Neoplatonism. So the dominant philosophical enterprise in this period is an evolution of the thinking of Plato. So Plato believes in the kind of our world and then the world of the forms, and the Neoplatonists, most famously Plotinus in the 3rd century and his disciple Porphyry, had developed a sort of more sophisticated version of this theory with sort of multiple transcendental levels emerging, as you say, from the one, but combined it with traditional myth and what we would think of as sort of traditional religion, and with an element of mysticism as well. So it's a sort of almost a grand theory that combines religion, philosophy and myth. Now, so Julian says that it's this moment with Maximus that is sort of the turning point for him. He also says elsewhere that as a child he had he says, I had a particular hankering for the sun and for the stars. And so some people have said, well, that distaste for Christianity is much earlier, is related to Constantius's treatment of his family, and maybe he's a sort of secret pagan from earlier on. I suppose one thing it's worth adding into that debate about when he converts is that modern sociology of conversion suggests that when people look back on their own conversions, they tend to think of it as a sort of light bulb intellectual moment. I was sort of exposed to something and that changed my mind. Whereas actually when you study how people convert, it tends to be a more gradual process, and it really depends on the networks that you're moving in. And I think it's not a coincidence that that period when he's with Maximus is a sort of moment of relative freedom for someone who has had a fairly traumatic, itinerant, controlled childhood, and he's moving around Asia Minor in the company of multiple different Neoplatonists. And so we might be better to ascribe the conversion to that more general period of intellectual and personal awakening, rather than just the kind of intellectual exposure he gets with Maximus.
Could you say what apostate means?
Apostate, in essence, means one who abandons something, in this case Christianity. So it's a denigratory term to say Julian the apostate is someone who abandons Christianity. Paul is an apostate because he abandons Judaism, is one who leaves a religion behind.
Is it possible to explain what he actually believed at this point in his life?
It's certainly possible to debate it. So he seems to have, most simply, he advocates the restoration of traditional Greco-Roman polytheism, and he wants to support the decline of Christianity, and so in some ways turn back the clock. Polytheism hasn't gone away, but it has not been supported by the state to the extent that it was beforehand, and Christianity has had a large number of benefits and privileges under the Constantinians. More specifically, what he believes, he is clearly philosophically committed to Neoplatonism and to a particularly mystical, even we might say magical version of Neoplatonism. So Maximus, who we've already mentioned, is too mystical, too magical, even for some of the other Neoplatonists. He seems to, as part of this, be a big believer in the return of sacrifice and mass animal sacrifice, which had been in relative decline. So Ammianus, for example, jokes that if Julian had survived, there wouldn't have been enough bulls in the empire. And he also has a particular kind of association with the cults of Mithras and Helios as well, which are in some ways versions of a solar monotheism that had been increasingly popular in the 3rd century, and that his family as a whole, the Constantinians, had a particular association with.
Thank you. Sean, now we're talking about very fast forward, we're talking about dizzying speed. It becomes a Caesar in the West in 355, and then emperor soon after that.
That's right.
How did that happen?
If I can just talk a bit about becoming Caesar, because there are very particular circumstances. So Constantius II, his cousin, had no children, and his 2 other brothers are killed, so he ends up being the sole Augustus. So he needs to bring other people in to help him rule, And initially he turns to his cousin Gallus, who is Julian's half-brother, and he was made Caesar in 351, but executed in 354 because he was seen as a bit of a loose cannon and potentially dangerous. So it's in the aftermath of that then Constantius II turns to Julian to bring him in as Caesar. He was brought to the court in Milan after the death of Gallus. He was sort of under suspicion because he was Gallus's half-brother. But after about a year, he is then appointed Caesar himself, and he is sent to Gaul. And some of our sources say he's just meant to be a figurehead. You know, he's meant to represent Constantius II there. But actually, he's very active in Gaul, and it turns out, you know, despite being this kind of archetypal student, very well educated, he seems to be a successful general. He seems keen to make himself popular in Gaul by reducing taxation. He has some clashes with bureaucrats, and he has a great military victory in 357, the Battle of Strasbourg. So he becomes very popular in Gaul, and actually at the Battle of Strasbourg, apparently the troops were already acclaiming him Augustus because they're supporting him. And then a couple of years later, in 360, when they're wintering in Paris, the troops are all gathered because Constantius II wants to transport some troops to the eastern frontier. He needs them in the east. And the troops are portrayed as being upset about this, so they acclaim Julian as Augustus in 360, spring 360, and he accepts this, and he tries to get Constantius II to kind of recognise this promotion.
Thank you very much for that. Almost uniquely with Roman emperors, we have the unique insight from himself. He wrote enormous amount, and then he read a satire, The Caesars. What did that tell us about him and them?
The Caesars is a unique text. It is, on the surface at least, a satire written by an emperor on all the past emperors of Rome. I'm not aware of any other emperor in any other empire of history who has done something similar, like satirize power from a position of power in this way. And in a sense, it is also intriguing that he should choose, that Julian should choose satire to speak about his predecessors, because if we think about the function of satire and how we usually associate it with the underdog, the subordinate, the person who is in need to speak obliquely to power because he's not in a position of power, then it is even more surprising that an emperor should choose to adopt these means to speak about his predecessors. I like to define it as, if you allow me to use the expression, a beauty pageant among Roman emperors, because essentially what happens in this piece is that there is a big banquet in the sky among the gods, and the gods decide to invite also the Roman emperors from the past to join the feast. And while they're feasting all together in the skies, at some point the gods decide to establish which of these emperors has been the best in ruling the Roman Empire. So in the moment in which this question is brought to the scene, you also begin to sense actually how behind the playfulness of the piece there is a fundamental question that Julian is raising here and will continue to raise through his literary production. That is the question of how should we be reading history, which for Romans, be they Christians or pagan, was always understood as providential history, as sacred history. How should we be reading history in a moment in which the divinity behind the history is being renegotiated? And this is the reason why, on the one hand, Julian is displaying all his skills as a scholar, as an erudite, as a reader of Homer, as a reader of Plutarch. He's bringing in emperors on the scene, and he's summoning the best-known features, vices, virtues. He's making all sorts of erudite puns and jokes about them. But on the other hand, he's also using this context to comment on the rule of the emperor that he thinks has, in a sense, ruined the Roman Empire, and that is inevitably Constantine, who is the buffoon of the piece, and is brought there as a votary of pleasure, as he is defined, and ridiculed and humiliated, and eventually shown to be the very worst of emperors, while Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher ruler, is shown to be the very best.
The thing about the Caesars that I've always found really intriguing, given that it is this sort of satire from the underdog perspective, is that, you know, all Roman men are obsessed with legacy, right? You know, how they will be remembered, and the few writings we have by other emperors are all concerned, you know, with memory, you know, Augustus, Marcus Aurelius, etc. But the Caesars, Julian Caesars, it's this curiously self-awareness about, you know, all of these emperors get roasted, essentially, right, by the gods. There's a focus on criticism, even of Augustus and Trajan and Marcus Aurelius and Alexander the Great, the sort of supposed heroes. So there's this kind of extraordinary, I've always felt, extraordinary awareness of your own vulnerability to posterity, that you are, you know, these are all the things that you can be critiqued for.
That is a wonderful point, and you are absolutely right in underscoring that, for instance, even Marcus Aurelius, who is deemed to be the very best, is at the same time criticized for the way he had favored his son despite the lack of merits of his son himself, and so on. Now, your comment made me think that, in a sense, at the beginning of the Caesars, Julian begins by mocking even himself and saying, I'm expected to write a satire because this is a festive occasion, it's the Saturnalia there, but I'm not good at writing jokes. So I will have to come up with something else. This is my mythos, this is my story.
I'm too serious.
Exactly, yeah. I'm too serious. And that, of course, is double-edged, because on the one hand he's criticizing himself, and on the other, though, he's signaling that there is this kernel of philosophical truth in his message that is the reflection of what makes a ruler a good one.
Can we, through you, Sean, can we bring Christianity back into the picture here? We have, I'm being very crude here, just forgive me. We're having a battle between Christianity and non-Christianity, let's call it paganism. And it's an extraordinary time to have, and it's an extraordinary battle subject to have. What do you make of it?
I think it's important to see it maybe in less polarized ways. I know it's very tempting to do that. I mean, Constantine seems to be a Christian, he supports Christianity, but he doesn't make Christianity like, you know, the state religion of the Roman Empire. Paganism still exists, as James has said. There's some debate even whether, you know, what exactly did Constantine do against paganism, so maybe the very limited measures against paganism. So it's more that he's setting an example, and maybe if you want to get on in the Roman Empire, you know, you'd want to follow the same religion. So to me it's less polarized, and I think what's so interesting about Julian, when he becomes emperor and can act on his religious beliefs, he's had to conceal his paganism. He doesn't go down the route of persecution of Christians, which previous emperors had done. He basically says toleration for everybody. Paganism, pagan cults. Some people think he's actually Christianity. I mean, he's deliberately trying to unpick the relationship between the Roman Empire and Christianity, which his uncle had started.
I was thinking that in respect to Julian's cunning strategies, also the idea of summoning back the exiled bishop is something that is, because on the one hand, Julian's toleration goes up to the point of promoting the return of the bishops who had been exiled by Constantius II, but that, of course, as Ammianus sees, is also a strategy to create internal struggle among different strands of Christianity.
Yes.
I mean, the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem is another good example of this, right? That, you know, ostensibly this is about sort of supporting another, you know, a traditional religion of the empire, rebuilding the temple. But the alternative reading of that is that Christian supersessionism has been built around the replacement of Judaism with Christianity, and in particular Jesus' prophecy in the Gospels that, you know, not one stone of the temple will remain upon another. So if the temple were to be rebuilt, ostensibly just supporting Judaism, but it would undermine Christian prophecies and claims to religious superiority.
Can we be specific here? Talk about his satire on Antioch, and why is that important? Do you want to start there?
So the Misopogon, in a sense, following up from what James was saying, is the next chapter in Julian's extraordinary exposure of his vulnerability as an emperor, because it is a satire that is on himself, and in particular on this outstanding feature of his appearance, that is his own beard, which he describes in gruesome details, including mentioning the lice that scamper about it. But it is very important to contextualize this self-mockery in which Julian responds to poems written by the citizens of Antioch deriding his appearance, and he keeps up the derision, and he joins the derision, we could say, and adds other scoffing remarks on the way he looks. But then this is just the beginning, because the strength of the piece is how progressively Julian turns the table around. And he reveals this to be a strategy of, in a sense, what Julian is doing is that he's revealing his unkempt appearance to be the appearance of the real philosopher. And he is contrasting with that the shaven and refined appearance of the citizens of Antioch, which is indicative of how they live a shallow, superficial lifestyle, because they are clinging to Christianity.
Are we talking about someone who, at the time, is it possible, James, to tell us, oh yes, it's that man who's putting forward this view, or did he just pass in the night and 700 years later we're going to be talked about?
No, it's fair to say that Julian was making a splash in his own day, as he did in posterity. So, at first glance, if you look at contemporary commentary, and there's a lot of it, it seems very polarized, right? It's along binary lines that you have pagan commentators like Libanius, Libanius is a famous orator of the day who's already been mentioned, like Ammianus Marcellinus, who's a contemporary, who's a historian, who speak in kind of almost, sometimes literally panegyrical terms. And they know Julian. Ammianus serves with him in the army. Libanius, indirectly at least, teaches him and liaises with him. And they speak very positively of him. On the other hand, you have other contemporaries that he knew, Christian classmates of his, for example. Gregory of Nazianzus is one of the most famous examples of these, who speak in equal and opposite negative terms about how Julian is the worst thing to happen to the empire. I mean, I think it is also important to remember, and this I think is often not talked about because we think about him as a legitimate emperor, but Julian is a usurper in some sense. He is an emperor who claims power when there is a legitimate sitting emperor, and that breeds a certain degree of instability, which Julian kind of gets away with because Constantius dies before there is outright civil war. But what most people care about most of the time throughout the Roman Empire is stability, because stability enables people's own lives and projects to prosper, and instability, civil war, is in general bad news for everybody except for the individual victors.
Just to add to that, I mean, James is right. I mean, you know, he's heading for civil war with his cousin, but then the cousin suddenly dies, so they don't have to fight each other. And, you know, most people think Constantius probably would have won if they had ended up in battle together.
He was very concerned about the borders, wasn't he?
He was concerned about the borders. I mean, I think you know, the Roman Empire has gone through quite a traumatic period in the 3rd century and then into the 4th century. I mean, they have been sort of focusing very much on civil war, but even Constantine the Great towards the end of his reign is campaigning over the Danube, so trying to reclaim territory that the Romans had, you know, famously, you know, the successors of Trajan in the 2nd century AD. Constantine is also about to embark on a campaign into Persia at the time of his death. So it is a kind of a common concern of the emperors in this period.
Speaking of the borders and the concern with borders, it is also the case that behind the borders, the situation was changing in very interesting ways in these decades. Because, for instance, in Iran, in Persia, since the 3rd century, there had been the rise of a new dynasty, the Sasanians, which was much more powerful and militarily aggressive than the predecessors, the Arsacids, and they were especially keen in confronting themselves with the Romans. While with the Germanic tribes, it is more difficult to understand exactly what was going on, but we see new gatherings and new coming together of. So it seems like these groups were becoming more able to come together and confront the Romans.
it's also true, I think, for Julian and all other emperors, that the word imperator means general. Without military success, it can be very difficult to establish legitimacy, particularly if you come to power in, let's say, interesting circumstances. So for Julian, campaigns on the northern frontier, the eastern frontier, they are the single best way to secure his own position, because if you are successful in battle, you prove definitively that you have the support of the gods, and that then underpins everything else you try and do. So military success is the way to be a successful emperor.
On the other hand, it backfired on him in Persia.
Spectacularly.
Yes, I think the Sasanian King of Kings, Shapur II, he really wants to kind of overturn a peace treaty that had been disadvantageous to Persia. So that's really what's going on. So there has been this constant pressure, revitalized pressure by the Persians on the eastern frontier in Mesopotamia and along the eastern frontier in particular. So it is a live issue. So it's not something Julian just says, oh, I know, go off and fight the Persians. The interesting thing about Julian generally is that we have so many sources, so we know much more about what he's up to compared to like other members of his family, what they had done. So we're quite informed about the details of the campaign by the historian Ammianus in particular, but also Libanius and other writers from the period as well. So he does seem to have had a particular strategy. So he left Antioch in March 363, and he tries to confuse the Persians. He pretends that he's going to the Tigris and across the Tigris, but then he goes back to the Euphrates and down the Euphrates to this Persian capital of Ctesiphon, this really important political royal center, and besieges it. And then it all seems to go completely wrong. So it's a bit of a mystery. He gets to Ctesiphon, and then it seems not to know what to do, or it doesn't capitalize on that, so begins going northwards again. Famously, he also burnt the fleet which they'd brought down the Tigris, so he destroys that before they start heading north. And then on the way north, he's wounded in a skirmish. So it's kind of very puzzling.